rules of the game or violate them or question them. As you've grasped in a number of your comments and questions, the denunciation of democratic opponents as illegitimate, threatening, disloyal, treasonous. Third, any toleration or encouragement of acts of violence. And that would include, saying, it's too bad we lost the good old days where, if you had a heckler in a campaign rally, you could just beat them up and send them to the hospital. Those were the good old days. Well, those were not good old days for democracy. And fourth, the readiness, obviously, to curtail media freedom or the civil liberties of opponents. So, those are the early warning signs. Now, I want to kind of briefly share with you some of the public opinion data, and we'll come back to this next week when we talk about political culture. We asked the question, are you satisfied with the way democracy is working in the country? Very satisfied, fairly satisfied, not very satisfied, not at all satisfied. Is this a measure of democratic legitimacy? No. Why do you say that?
It's about a perception of democracy, which I think plays into it because it's mass norms and behavior, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like an analytical look at democracy itself.
Does everyone agree with that? Good. All right, so we don't need to get diverted here. So, you know what the biggest test of democratic legitimacy is? It's when people are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in their country and still say unequivocally that democracy is the best form of government. And then, of course, they either want to change the particular ruling party so they can get policies they like more, or maybe they have institutional reforms in mind that can make democracy work better. So now we start getting to some questions that I think can shed more light on democratic legitimacy. Here's a 1 to 10 scale. How important do you think it is? Choose 1, not important at all, 10, extremely important, to live in a country that is governed democratically. And you can see most of the advanced democratic countries have very high average levels here. The modal response is, or average, in this case, average response is, over 8 in most places. That kind of suggests democracy is very important to people. We asked the World Values System survey, which is administered in 60, 70 countries or more every 3 or 4 years, asked, well, what do you think about a democratic system? Is it very good, fairly good, rather bad, or a very bad way to govern a country? And you'd want, if a democracy is consolidated, you would expect that well over 70%, at minimum 70%, I'd say, of the public would say it's a good or fairly good way to govern a country. Unless they're thinking in the Churchillian sense, and this is why we need a lot of different items, that actually it's rather bad, but it's better than any alternative. Anyway, we'll get to those measures. This is the United States here, the thick blue line. I'm sorry that they're not all showing on this slide which countries they are. I'll try and fix that. But this is the United States, and kind of Germany and Sweden and so on. Canada tend to be up here. And this is the Netherlands, the red line here. And you can see, actually, there was a dip. This is part of what Yascha Mounk was writing about, is this decline here between 2000 and 2014. But in a more recent survey, it was found to be about 87%. So that isn't a particular warning sign. Now the Churchillian question, democracies may have its problems, that's the full question, but it's better than any other form of government. Well, this wasn't quite so good in the US, 74%. Canada is usually higher than the United States in its response to these questions. But the countries of concern are the ones that I think are well below 70%. Most of all, Mexico, which is going through a difficult period. And I think if you look at the public opinion survey data, I think it's hard to conclude from the public opinion survey data that at this level of mass political commitment to democracy, that democracy is fully consolidated. The data is telling us for both Mexico and Brazil, where there are huge problems of economic and political performance, of inequality, of crime, and massive, massive corruption, that people's faith in democracy has been, eroded over time and is kind of a little bit, at least, in flux. But it's still very high in Argentina, and you see in some of these Asian democracies, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Now I showed you on Tuesday 3 of my favorite questions, which is to put the authoritarian options to people. Forget about the word democracy, okay? Democracy is not the only way of organizing a political system. There are lots of ways of governing a country. What about these other systems? What do you think about having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Parliament or Congress and elections? Now, what does it mean, doesn't have to bother with? Well, it's left deliberately ambiguous, but the idea is, what about having a strong leader who can just make decisions? You like that idea? And the more people like that idea, the more you should worry about the health and solidity of democracy. What we saw here in the US, the thick blue line, is that there was a kind of steady rise between the mid-1990s and 2014 in the percentage saying, yes, not a bad idea to have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with all this stuff. But it did decline dramatically in 2017, maybe, you can complete the sentence, maybe because they got a taste of what that would look like and it gave them some concern. In any case, in Spain, you can see it spiked way up and then it declined way down. I can't explain fully why this happened. You see some volatility in this measure over time, but actually a somewhat reassuring trend here. This is, I will say, these figures here are from the World Values Survey, and these are from the Pew Global Survey in 2017. So maybe they're using a little bit different sampling methodology, but this is not too alarming. It's actually Japan that scores worst on this measure in 2017 at 31%. How about army rule? Does this surprise you that 1 of 6 Americans say, not a bad idea? In fact, it's very good or fairly good idea to have the army rule. Aside from Japan again at 15%, there's no other country that comes close in terms of its willingness to entertain having army rule. Now, this was frankly a little bit unsettling and even mystifying to us in the voter study group project to look at attitudes and values toward democracy in the United States that I was collaborating in with some other people, sponsored by the Democracy Fund in Washington, D.C. So we actually did some qualitative interviews with people who said they thought this was a very good or fairly good idea. And I can deliver, I think, some tentative, somewhat speculative, but maybe modest, slightly reassuring news. A lot of the people who said, yeah, army rule, that would be a good idea, clearly did not have in their minds the the Chief of Staff of the United States Armed Forces going on the radio and announcing that the Speaker of the House and the President of the United States and everybody else had been arrested, the Constitution was being suspended, and there'd be a military dictatorship. This is not what people had in mind. It's that they saw, yeah, things are unraveling. There's a lot of crime. There's a lot of uncontrolled immigration. It'd be much better if the Army would come in and kind of control the streets and straighten things out, maybe control the border. So this is mainly what people have in mind. Now, it's not, I think for most people, it's not military dictatorship, but it's not liberal democracy either. Okay, so how do we see the distribution of support for a strong leader and for army rule in a variety of other countries surveyed in 2017 by the Pew Global Attitudes Survey? And what we see is, we're in an era now where there's, aside from the US, as I explained it, there's not a lot of support for military rule, but there is this kind of populist residue of support for the idea of a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with the constraints and insufferable indignities of elections and criticism and parliamentary obstruction and so on and so forth. And this is the base of readiness to consider what is, I think, the principal current challenge to democracy in the advanced industrial democracies, which is not a military coup. It's not some megalomaniacal dictator going on TV and announcing the suspension of the Constitution. It's the gradual strangulation of the liberal aspects of democracy by an elected, illiberal, populist leader. Any questions or comments?
I'm just curious, like those charts you showed before, where you're combining data from the Pew in 2017 and those other things. I guess how do you know? Like I guess how close are they together? Is there so much, like what's uncertainty is there?
What, you mean the different surveys?
Yeah.
Comparing them? I think the principal caution I would exert, there's a little bit of caution about, are they drawing their samples and weighting them in the same way? But that shouldn't produce, I don't think, dramatically different results. But here's what I will tell you from my experience, public opinion survey research can produce surprisingly different results, is even slight changes in wording. So you really want to, as much as possible, when you're pulling together these public opinion survey questions, look for questions that have precise or virtually precise wording. And one of the things that certainly gives me pause is just the nuances of language. Okay, we're translating this into Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and so on, and fairly subtle concepts like what does bother mean in Chinese or Japanese. So, the cross-cultural translation of these concepts and words is another challenge that we need to be alert to. But you've got to begin, you can't take, one thing we know is you can't take the question, would you say that even though it may not be perfect, but that democracy overall is the best system of the world. It may have its problems, but overall it's the best system. You can't equate that with the question, would you say that sometimes an authoritarian government may be preferable, or that democracy is always preferable, or that you don't care? First of all, you got 3 response categories instead of 2. And second of all, you got really 2 different kinds of concepts. And we know from experience they tend to yield different levels of support for democracy. So next week we're going to probe, first of all, the concept of political culture. I think I'm right in saying that's next week. And then we're going to get deeper into this public opinion survey data. I'll show you some analysis of what shapes attitudes toward democracy versus authoritarianism. We'll look more comparatively across regions. But that's for next week. I hope you have a good weekend.